My wife blocked my number after my neighbors showed her proof about me at their secret Tuesday meetings, so I collapsed their ring. 2 years later, she's still recovering from whatever they planted in her head. When Mr. Petrov moved into our quiet neighborhood, I was washing my car in the driveway, watching the moving truck pull up to the corner house that had been empty for months. He stepped out, and I just felt something off about him. It didn't help that he never made eye contact with anyone. Tanya from 2 houses down had already started walking over with her famous welcome cookies, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw his face, and her smile just vanished before she turned and practically ran back to her house. My phone started buzzing like crazy, and when I checked the neighborhood group chat, Tanya had already posted, "OMG, just Googled our new neighbor Petrov. He's on the SX offender website." The messages exploded with shock and anger, and within minutes, Barb, our HOA president, posted an emergency meeting at her house. My wife read over my shoulder and grabbed my arm, saying we need to go to this meeting. That evening, over 20 neighbors packed into Barb's living room. Barb passed around printed registry pages saying the offense involved a minor 20 years ago. But do we really need to know more when our children walk past that house every day? Her husband checked Zillow on his laptop while neighbors shared fears, and one father announced he was installing cameras. The next morning, my 16-year-old son Reggie mentioned he had helped a new neighbor carry a box and said he seemed nice but really sad. My wife cut him off asking if he talked to him alone and started checking Reggie over like he had been exposed to something toxic. She told him to never go near that house again, not even walk on that side of the street. Reggie said the man just seemed lonely. She snapped back that lonely men who hurt children always seem nice. The ostracization started immediately with mothers crossing the street when Petrov walked by, and his hellos were met with silence. Kids started daring each other to ring his doorbell and run, and I saw his grocery deliveries smashed on his porch. At the dog park one morning, I watched him arrive with an old golden retriever, and every other owner immediately leashed up and left. One woman loudly said, "I don't feel safe with him here," leaving Petrov standing alone, throwing a ball for his confused dog. The day everything changed was when elderly Mr. Warner had a heart episode while mowing, and Petrov, who was closest, ran over immediately performing CPR, while Mrs. Warner called 911. But when paramedics arrived, she wouldn't stop screaming, "Get away from him!" even though Petrov had already backed away, letting the professionals take over. Later, Barb posted that a predator had touched her father with no mention that he had saved her father's life. My curiosity piqued, and I did deeper research, finding out that his conviction was when he was 19 and was caught with a 17-year-old victim. But then I found a marriage license from 1 year later and a birth announcement for his daughter in 2006. Cold washed over me when I found the obituaries from 2020, showing his wife and daughter were called by a hammered driver. Everything shifted the night my wife was away, and it was just me and Reggie. At 11 p.m., I heard breaking glass downstairs. Looking out, I saw an unfamiliar truck, and through the banister could see 2 men inside our living room, one holding a crowbar ransacking the place, while my phone sat uselessly in the kitchen. My son woke, and I whispered for him to lock the door and hide as footsteps came up the stairs. I grabbed Reggie's baseball bat as the intruder kicked in the bedroom door. Suddenly, a shout from downstairs rang out, "Police are coming!" I recognized Petrov's voice as he had seen the broken window and came to check on us. I heard a loud bang, making the intruders panic and run. By the time I came downstairs, Petrov was on the lawn shouting the license plate number repeatedly and calling 911 from the yard. Police arrived quickly, and Petrov gave a perfect description, staying to give his statement despite neighbors gathering and glaring before leaving quietly. The next morning, Barb was at my door asking if I was okay, but before I could explain, she continued saying, "Him watching your house at night isn't normal, and how did he happen to see them? Maybe he was with them." By afternoon, she made everyone believe Petrov admitted to watching houses at night, and people spiraled suggesting he was grooming the neighborhood. I baked cookies to thank him, but my wife intercepted asking if I was insane. We argued until we compromised to leave them on his porch. Then someone posted his work address online, and his employer got calls about employing predators. He came home with a box of belongings the next day. I knew this was spiraling towards something terrible, and knew he didn't deserve the false claims made against him. I knew I had to do something about it. At 5 a.m., I jolted awake to a scratching sound at my front door. My heart pounded as I crept downstairs, finding a folded note that had been slipped underneath. The handwriting was unfamiliar, almost childlike. "Stop defending him or lose everything." My phone on the kitchen counter showed 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Each voicemail was just breathing, then hanging up. I texted Petrov to meet me at the abandoned gas station on Route 47. When he arrived, I noticed fresh scratches running down both his arms, some deep enough to have bled recently. He pulled his sleeves down when he saw me looking. I asked what happened. He shook his head, staring at the cracked concrete. After a long silence, he finally spoke. They had threatened his sister too. She lived 3 states away, but someone had sent her photos of her kids at school. He warned that my family could be next. One of the scratches on his left arm looked disturbingly like a child's fingernail mark, small and desperate. When I got home, my wife was sitting at the kitchen table with an envelope. She'd been invited to join a neighborhood safety group that met Tuesday mornings at Barb's house. The invitation was signed by someone named Linda, a name I'd never heard in our 5 years living here. My wife admitted she'd already attended one meeting last week while I was at work. She hadn't mentioned it because she knew I'd be upset. The group discussed keeping children safe from predators, she explained, avoiding my eyes. That afternoon, Reggie came home upset. His girlfriend Victoria's parents had forbidden her from seeing him, citing family associations. But Victoria had whispered to him during their brief goodbye that her mom wasn't angry, she was scared of someone. The girl's hands had been shaking. I decided to check our security system, something nagging at me. The login history showed remote access 3 days ago at 2:47 a.m., not from any device we owned. Scrolling through footage from the night of the break-in, I found most of it corrupted, displaying only static, except for one clear segment showing Petrov running across our lawn to help. Only his appearance remained uncorrupted, as if someone wanted to make sure he was seen. My wife started packing bags for her and Reggie while I was in the shower. When I asked where they were going, she just said somewhere safe until I came to my senses. She wouldn't look at me, just kept folding clothes with mechanical precision. Reggie stood in the doorway, confused and scared, but she told him to get his things. After they left, I drove past Petrov's house. 3 unfamiliar cars with out-of-state plates were parked outside, occupants photographing his property. One man was measuring the fence line while another took pictures of every window. I decided to follow when they pulled away. The cars led me to an empty parking lot behind the old mall. When they drove off, I found a manila folder on the ground where one car had been parked. Inside were photographs of Petrov spanning 20 years, taken in multiple cities. Some showed him as a young man, others more recent. All taken from a distance, all without his knowledge. Tanya's husband Nathan found me at the grocery store the next day. He pulled me aside near the frozen foods, checking over his shoulder repeatedly. He warned that Barb wasn't the only one who wanted Petrov gone, that this went deeper than I understood. Before I could ask questions, he spotted someone watching us and hurried away, leaving his half-full cart behind. My mother called that evening, crying. Someone had sent her articles about harboring predators with my photo attached, suggesting I was enabling danger to children. She lived 2 hours away and had no connection to our neighborhood drama. Whoever was doing this had researched my family. The next morning, I found Petrov's employment termination letter in my mailbox, dated the day after someone had posted his work address online. The letter cited multiple complaints received on the same date, all using identical language about customer safety concerns. Someone had coordinated this perfectly. Near midnight, I was taking out trash when Mrs. Warner approached from the shadows. She grabbed my arm, whispering urgently that her husband hadn't really had a heart episode that day. Before I could respond, she saw curtains move in a neighbor's window and ran back to her house, leaving me standing alone under the streetlight. My wife texted from wherever she was staying. They showed me proof. It's worse than you know. Don't contact us. When I tried calling, my number had been blocked. I discovered a second neighborhood group chat on my wife's tablet, active for 3 months since Petrov moved in. The chat was titled Corner House Problem and had 37 members, all discussing strategies for dealing with unwanted residents. Reading back, I learned Petrov was the 3rd problem resident in 5 years. The previous 2 families had left abruptly after escalating incidents. Barb made a big show of volunteering for the church youth group that week, posting photos of herself surrounded by smiling children. The timing wasn't subtle. She was positioning herself as the neighborhood's protector of innocence. My boss called me into his office, showing me a package of concerned parent letters he'd received. Each had different handwriting but used identical phrases about employee judgment and company values. He said he had no choice but to put me on administrative leave while they investigated. Mrs. Chen, who'd lived here for 40 years, pulled me aside during my evening walk. She whispered that the last corner house family hadn't moved away like everyone said. They'd disappeared one night, leaving everything behind. The forwarding address they'd given didn't exist. She'd tried to find them to return a borrowed book and discovered they'd simply vanished. I started following Barb during my forced time off. She met with a woman I didn't recognize at a coffee shop downtown. The woman had lived in our neighborhood 15 years ago, but now returned monthly for these meetings. I watched from across the street as she handed Barb a thick file. Later that night, I went through Barb's trash. Among the coffee grounds and junk mail, I found shredded papers. Piecing them together revealed mentions of monitoring assignments and payment schedules. The woman was being paid to track corner house residents. Multiple addresses were listed, all corner houses in different neighborhoods across 3 counties. 3 different neighbors mentioned their young children had been having nightmares about the bad man, though none of the kids had ever interacted with Petrov. The children used identical phrases when describing their fears, words too sophisticated for their ages. I started documenting when harassment incidents occurred, noticing a pattern. Every incident happened when specific cars were absent from the neighborhood, as if orchestrated around certain schedules. A text came from Petrov's former co-worker. They contacted me too. It's bigger than Barb. Can't meet. Not safe. When I tried responding, the number was already disconnected. Researching property records revealed 5 families had fled the corner house in 12 years. Each experienced escalating harassment, starting with dead animals on doorsteps, break-ins where nothing was stolen, children shunned at school, and anonymous threats. All had experienced some tragedy before moving in: deaths, divorces, or financial ruin. My wife's best friend Catherine admitted my wife was staying with someone from the group, but wouldn't say who. She looked terrified when I pressed for details, glancing around as if being watched. Mr. Warner left a voicemail at 3 a.m., speaking in a rushed whisper. My wife saw Barb in our basement last week, found old blueprints hidden there. She's at her Tuesday morning prayer group tomorrow. Check then. The message cut off abruptly. I knew I was running out of time. Whatever was happening in our neighborhood was bigger and older than just Petrov's arrival. The note under my door had been a warning, but also a revelation. They were organized, had been for years, and I was now in their crosshairs for refusing to play along. The anonymous text arrived while I was searching through property records at the library. My phone buzzed with an image that made my blood freeze. Reggie stood in what looked like someone's living room, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. The message beneath read simply, "He's safe as long as you stop." My hands shook as I studied every detail of the photo, trying to identify where my son was being held. Something about the wallpaper caught my attention. The distinctive floral pattern triggered a memory. I'd seen it before at the Hendersons' house during a neighborhood barbecue 2 summers ago. The Hendersons who had vanished overnight, leaving everything behind. My stomach churned as I realized whoever had my son was using an abandoned house right here in our neighborhood. I drove past the Henderson place 3 times before parking 2 blocks away. The house looked exactly as it had for 2 years, overgrown lawn and newspapers yellowing on the porch, but fresh tire tracks in the driveway told a different story. I circled to the back, finding a basement window with a board recently pried loose. Inside, the house felt alive despite its abandonment. Fresh footprints disturbed the dust. In the living room where Reggie had been photographed, I found evidence of recent occupation: empty water bottles, fresh food wrappers, and disturbingly, children's drawings taped to the walls. Each drawing showed the same figure, a dark shape labeled the bad man with the face violently scratched out. Meeting notes lay scattered on a card table. My hands trembled as I photographed each page. Phase 3 initiated. Corner house must be vacant by winter solstice. December 21st was only 3 weeks away. Other pages listed addresses, all corner properties with dates and outcomes. Successful relocation appeared next to most entries. The sound of approaching cars sent me scrambling for the back door. I barely made it to my car before police cruisers surrounded the Henderson house. Someone had been watching, waiting for me to break in. At my workplace 20 minutes later, officers arrived asking about a breaking and entering report. They wouldn't say who had called it in, but their questions were perfunctory, almost rehearsed. My administrative leave made avoiding the neighborhood impossible. I started noticing things I'd missed before. 3 teenagers mentioned their parents had been attending special meetings every Tuesday and Thursday. The kids complained their parents would skip important events rather than miss these gatherings. When questioned about the meetings, the adults all developed the same nervous tick, touching their left ear while insisting it was just a book club. The property records revealed a disturbing pattern. The corner house had been sold to the same trust 5 times over 12 years. Each time, a family would move in, last between 6 months and 2 years, then flee. The trust would buy it back at a loss, then resell it. The trust's registered address led to a law office that had closed in 1994. A former resident reached out through social media. The woman who'd lived in the corner house in 2011 had tracked me down after seeing my name in an online neighborhood forum. She explained how they'd been convinced their daughter was in danger from an unnamed threat. They'd fled in terror, abandoning careers and friendships. Only years later did they realize their daughter had never been in any danger. The threat had been manufactured, the fear artificially induced through coordinated harassment. My next encounter with Barb came at the grocery store. Instead of confronting her with anger, I remained silent when she approached. My calculated calm seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation would have. Her hands shook as she backed away, mumbling about needing to get home. The woman who'd orchestrated so much fear was herself afraid of something. That night, another note appeared under my door. December 21st. Corner house empty or consequences escalate. This is generational. The handwriting was different this time. Older, more formal. Someone else was involved. Someone above Barb in whatever hierarchy existed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mr. Warner's daughter arrived at my door before dawn, glancing nervously over her shoulder. She immediately asked who else knew about the basement discovery. When I hesitated, she pushed past me into the house, checking windows before explaining she'd been researching for months. Her father's supposed heart episode had been the final straw that convinced her something sinister was happening. She'd found connections going back decades. The same 12 families had lived in the neighborhood continuously for over 10 years. All held positions of subtle influence. All had children who'd grown up together, married within the group, and continued the pattern. The corner house wasn't random. It was central to something she couldn't quite define. Barb's mask finally slipped during a tense meeting at the community center. When pressed about inconsistencies in her story about Petrov, she let slip that they'd been protecting the neighborhood for 40 years. The problem was, property records showed she'd only lived here for 15. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as she realized her mistake. Her recovery was swift but desperate. She offered me a deal. Join them, learn the truth, protect my family, or continue resisting and lose everything. The threat was clear even as she maintained her suburban smile. Around us, other longtime residents watched with expressions ranging from fear to resignation. My wife's car in Barb's driveway at 2 a.m. confirmed my worst fears. Despite claiming to be at her sister's 3 states away, she was still in the neighborhood, still under their influence. Whatever hold they had on her was stronger than I'd realized. Warner's daughter brought research that changed everything. The corner house sat on what had been church property in the 1940s. The deed contained strange provisions about maintaining the moral purity of residents. The original church had burned in 1952, but the restrictions remained. The 12 families were descendants of the original church elders who'd created these provisions. The discovery of hidden cameras in my home shouldn't have surprised me, but the timestamp did. The devices had been installed 3 years ago, long before Petrov's arrival. We'd been watched, cataloged, studied. The IP address they transmitted to was registered to a church that had been defunct for decades. My phone rang with Reggie's number, though I knew they'd taken his phone. His voice sounded exhausted, disoriented. He'd escaped from where they'd been holding him but didn't know where he was. He warned that something had been done to his mother's mind. The meetings weren't what they seemed. They'd kept him awake for days, forcing him to watch videos about community responsibility and the dangers of moral contamination. I found him at a gas station 6 miles away, dehydrated and shaking. His story came in fragments. The abandoned houses were staging areas. The Tuesday meetings were indoctrination sessions. They'd tried to convince him I was dangerous, that Petrov was just the latest threat I'd invited into their sacred space. But the constant repetition and sleep deprivation had backfired, making him see the manipulation for what it was. Despite everything, I couldn't run. If we fled like the others, another family would simply take our place in the cycle. The pattern would continue. Petrov would be driven out, the corner house would claim new victims, and the 12 families would maintain their twisted version of protection. Confronting Barb with the evidence I'd gathered, she laughed. The sound was hollow, devoid of her usual practiced warmth. She wasn't in charge, she admitted. She was middle management at best. As she spoke, I noticed faces in every window of the surrounding houses. We were being watched by the entire network. Security footage from multiple sources painted a clear picture. The harassment campaigns were coordinated with military precision. Grocery deliveries destroyed at exactly 3:47 p.m. Threatening calls placed at synchronized intervals. Dead animals left on doorsteps at 5:23 a.m. The timing was too perfect to be spontaneous. Barb's husband proved to be an unexpected ally. While she attended another meeting, he searched her locked home office. The filing cabinet contained detailed files on every corner house family since 1987. Each file documented their vulnerabilities, their tragedies, their breaking points. The clinical precision of the records was chilling. Cracks appeared in the foundation of the 12 families. 2 couples approached me separately, expressing desire to leave but terror at the consequences. They mentioned signed confessions Barb held, documents that could destroy their lives if released. The web of mutual blackmail kept everyone trapped in their roles. Local business owners admitted they'd been threatened, serve Petrov, and face revelation of manufactured secrets. One restaurant owner had been told they'd spread rumors about health code violations. A grocery store manager was threatened with accusations of inappropriate behavior. All lies, but in a small community, lies could destroy livelihoods. During an unguarded moment, Barb revealed their core belief. The corner house was corrupted ground that attracted broken souls. By driving driving out the damaged, they protected the community from spiritual contamination. The delusion ran deep, rooted in decades of reinforced paranoia and selective interpretation of tragedies. 5 different families approached me with 5 different versions of why they participated. One claimed fear for their children, another cited property values, a third mentioned vague threats, but all their stories contained the same phrase: the foundation requires it. None could explain what the foundation actually was. The original subdivision blueprints revealed a final secret. Utility tunnels connected 3 houses, including Barb's. Built in the 1950s for coal delivery, they'd been supposedly sealed, but fresh airflow suggested otherwise. The network had literal underground connections to move unseen through the neighborhood. In the library archives, I found the newspaper clipping that connected everything. Local boy missing after corner house incident, dated October 1987. The boy's name stopped my heart: Peter Petrov Jr. The current Petrov wasn't random. He was the missing boy's nephew, come to find answers about a family tragedy buried for decades. My attempts to protect neighborhood children by enrolling them in schools outside the district met with unexpected gratitude. 3 sets of parents thanked me with tears in their eyes, mentioning their relief at breaking free from something they couldn't quite name. The indoctrination was generational, but it could be interrupted. 7 families formally requested an investigation into the HOA's activities. Within hours, all 7 retracted their complaints, citing misunderstandings. The speed of their reversals spoke to the immediate pressure applied, but the fact they'd tried it all showed the fear was beginning to crack. Barb's own evidence began to work against her. The timestamps on her surveillance photos showed impossible sequences. She claimed to have seen events that occurred while she was provably elsewhere. Her network's obsessive documentation was becoming their weakness, as lies compounded upon lies. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally came. Barb's practiced suburban sweetness vanished entirely, replaced by something ancient and ugly. Her rage at my interference was primal. She spoke of cleansing the ground, of maintaining purity, of protecting what their grandparents had built. Even her allies seemed frightened by the transformation. Research revealed 2 reporters had tried exposing this story before, one in 1995, another in 2008. Both had died in accidents within months of their investigations. Car crashes with no witnesses. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. The library archives held scattered pieces of the 1987 incident. Police reports, church newsletters, neighborhood association minutes. Each source provided fragments that together painted a picture of a community's shared delusion born from tragedy. A child's death transformed into a supernatural threat requiring eternal vigilance. An insurance investigator's visit provided unexpected validation. He mentioned the corner house generated claims every few years. Break-ins, vandalism, water damage. Always filed, always withdrawn before investigation. The pattern stretched back decades, invisible to anyone not looking for it. Barb's inner circle began to fracture when she was spotted entering Petrov's yard at 3 a.m. with surveying equipment. Her claim of checking property lines fooled no one. Whatever ritual or obsession drove her was escalating beyond their comfort level. The revelation that my own family had moved here through the same trust that controlled the corner house hit hard. We hadn't been random neighbors. We'd been selected, groomed, tested. The 3-year-old cameras in our home suggested we'd been backup candidates if the corner house remained empty too long. In a moment of unexpected humanity, I helped Barb's husband protect their children from their mother's influence. The kids mentioned mommy's special friends who visited at night, people who scared them. Even within the 12 families, the next generation was beginning to resist. 10 of the 12 core families voted to end their involvement, but the 2 missing families held decisive votes, and their absence was conspicuous. When they returned a week later, they claimed no memory of the missing time. Matching scars on their left wrists suggested their absence hadn't been voluntary. The truth about the original incident emerged through careful reconstruction. In 1987, prominent families had covered up an accidental death, transforming tragedy into mythology. The boy who died became a symbol of external threat. The corner house where it happened became cursed ground. Guilt metamorphosed into righteous protection. Barb's final desperate act was to barricade herself inside the corner house. For 3 days, neighbors reported hearing her on the phone, making frantic calls. When she emerged, she clutched a 1950s ledger and claimed the original founding families had shown her the truth through old documents. The neighborhood's attempt to return to normalcy failed when strange symbols began appearing on doors throughout the community. The markings were subtle, easily missed, but followed a clear pattern. Whatever Barb had awakened in the corner house was spreading beyond her control. State authorities arrived to investigate based on Warner's daughter's report. Their departure after just 1 hour raised more questions than answers. The lead investigator's last name matched one of the original 1987 families. The network's reach extended beyond our small neighborhood. I presented evidence to the remaining rational neighbors. The pattern was clear. Corner house residents were chosen for specific traumas. All had lost children the same age as the 1987 victim. The 12 families weren't protecting against threat. They were perpetuating a cycle of grief, feeding something that required regular sacrifice of the broken. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The oldest resident, dismissed as senile, had moments of clarity. She revealed the original 12 families had made a pact after the 1987 tragedy. They believed they could prevent future harm by maintaining spiritual purity. The corner house would draw the damaged, and the damaged would be expelled. Petrov's true purpose in moving here was finally revealed. Through genealogy research, he'd discovered his uncle was the 1987 victim. He'd come seeking answers about a family tragedy that had destroyed his father's mental health. Instead, he'd found himself trapped in a recurring nightmare that claimed new victims every few years. Documentation hidden in the ruins of the original church showed the full delusion. The families believed driving out damaged people protected the community from spiritual contamination. Their prosperity was tied to these cleansings. Every successful expulsion reinforced their belief. Every tragedy that followed a resident's departure proved the danger they'd avoided. The final piece of evidence revealed Barb's recruitment. As a teenager, she'd been assaulted. The 12 families had used her real trauma to bind her to their cause. She wasn't a leader, but a victim herself, transformed transformed into an enforcer through decades of manipulation. The community divided between those wanting to break free and those terrified of losing their protection. Meetings grew heated. Friendships ended. The social fabric that had held the neighborhood together for decades began to unravel. During a meeting about ending the cycle, the corner house spontaneously caught fire. The fire marshal found accelerant throughout the structure, but no ignition source. The families interpreted this as a warning. Some blamed me for angering whatever force they'd spent decades appeasing. Even allies suggested my family should leave town, but departure was impossible now. My wife had returned, but she spoke in the flat affect of the indoctrinated. She repeated phrases from Barb's meetings verbatim. Whatever they'd done to her during those sessions had taken root. I found myself working alone as the neighborhood retreated into fearful silence. Petrov left a note in my mailbox. "You're braver than I am." He'd already begun packing, preparing to flee like so many before him. The decision to expose everything publicly triggered immediate response. All 12 families converged on my house in a show of force. Their message was clear: back down or face consequences that would destroy not just me, but my family for generations. The confrontation revealed the tragic truth. Each of the 12 families had lost children in various tragedies over the decades. They'd been promised protection if they maintained the cleansing cycle. Their grief had been weaponized, transformed into a system that perpetuated the very suffering they sought to prevent. As winter approached and December 21st loomed, the stakes crystallized. The corner house had to be empty by the winter solstice, or the consequences would escalate. But empty for what? And why that specific date? The answers lay buried in decades of delusion and manipulated grief, waiting to be exposed. The neighborhood held its breath, caught between the fear of change and the exhaustion of maintaining a decades-old lie. The foundation they'd built on tragedy was crumbling, but whether that would bring freedom or catastrophe remained to be seen. The entire neighborhood gathered at the corner house for what Barb called the final resolution meeting. The hastily repaired structure still smelled of smoke and fresh paint. Construction permits posted on the door were dated months ago, suggesting this gathering had been planned long before the fire. I had no choice but to attend. They had made it clear that my family's safety depended on my presence. Inside, the 12 core families formed a tight circle in what had been Petrov's living room. Barb stood at the center, clutching the 1950s ledger she'd retrieved during her 3-day barricade. Her eyes had a fevered quality I'd never seen before. The other families watched her with a mixture of reverence and fear. She began explaining how the original founders' descendants still controlled the neighborhood through the property trust. Their grandparents had established a vision of moral purity that each generation was bound to maintain. The corner house served as a lightning rod, drawing in the spiritually damaged so they could be expelled before contaminating the community. The winter solstice marked the annual renewal of their covenant. The truth about the break-in finally emerged. The intruders weren't random criminals, but previous corner house residents who'd returned to warn Petrov. They'd been trying to save him from what they'd endured. The 12 families had orchestrated my involvement, ensuring I'd be home to witness Petrov's intervention. They needed the neighborhood to see him as a threat, even when he was helping. Petrov sat silently in the corner, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When pressed, he admitted he'd come here hoping to expose the truth about his uncle's death in 1987. He'd spent years tracking down leads, following the trail of broken families who'd fled this corner house. But he'd underestimated the depth of the conspiracy, the generations of indoctrination that protected it. He showed us his left forearm, where a small birthmark matched the description in the 1987 police reports. He was definitely Peter Petrov Jr.'s nephew. The meeting reached a crescendo when Barb demanded I choose: join the foundation and protect my family, or resist and face complete destruction. She gestured to the other families, reminding me that they controlled local businesses, had connections throughout the county, and had protected this neighborhood for decades. All I had to do was accept my role in maintaining the cycle. I made my decision. From my jacket, I pulled out copies of every document I'd collected: property records, meeting notes, surveillance footage, timestamps, the 1987 police reports, everything. But instead of threatening exposure, I handed the originals to Warner's daughter, who'd been secretly recording the entire meeting. She'd already sent copies to state authorities, carefully choosing investigators with no connection to the founding families. The FBI arrived within hours, not because of any dramatic conspiracy, but because the property trust had been evading taxes for decades. Financial crimes, not supernatural beliefs, would be their downfall. The agents seemed unsurprised by what they found, as if they'd been building this case for years, waiting for someone inside to break ranks. The underground tunnels chose that moment to collapse. Weakened by the fire and recent heavy rains, the 1950s infrastructure gave way. Water mains burst, flooding the connected basements. The symbolic collapse of their literal underground network sent the 12 families into panic. Some fled immediately, loading cars with whatever they could carry. Others stood frozen, watching their carefully constructed world crumble. In the chaos, historical documents stored in the tunnels were destroyed. Decades of meticulous records, the evidence of their organized harassment, their financial manipulations, their coordinated campaigns, all of it swept away in a torrent of muddy water. The red clay mud that bubbled up through the street drains looked disturbingly like blood, as if the ground itself was purging the poison that had infected it for so long. The 12 families scattered. Some simply vanished overnight, following the pattern of the corner house families they'd driven away. Others retreated into their homes, refusing to answer doors or phones. A few attempted to maintain the fiction that nothing had changed, showing up for their Tuesday meetings at Barb's flooded house, sitting in waterlogged chairs, pretending the foundation still existed. Barb's final manipulation came when she tried to name me as the new leader. Standing in the ruined corner house, she announced to the remaining neighbors that I had proven myself worthy by exposing the weak links in their organization. This was all part of the plan, she insisted. The foundation needed fresh blood, new leadership to guide them into the next generation. But her words fell on deaf ears. Everyone was too exhausted, too afraid, or too relieved to continue the charade. Within days, only 5 families remained in the neighborhood, all recent arrivals who'd never been part of the inner circle. Petrov and I stood in his empty house as he packed the last of his belongings. He decided to leave despite my efforts efforts to convince him to stay. The corner house had taken too much from his family. He couldn't remain in a place so poisoned by grief and delusion. The authorities found Barb 3 weeks later, wandering downtown with no memory of the past 15 years. Doctors diagnosed it as dissociative amnesia, brought on by extreme psychological stress. Whether it was genuine or a calculated escape from accountability, no one could say. She eventually took a job at a craft store 3 towns over, helping customers with scrapbooking supplies, seemingly content in her blank slate existence. The city condemned the corner house and demolished it within a month. No developer would touch the land, despite its prime location. It remained an empty lot, slowly being reclaimed by grass and wildflowers. New families moving into the neighborhood assumed it had always been a small park. Children played there on summer evenings, though some reported strange whispers coming from underground when the wind was still. The financial investigation revealed the scope of the conspiracy, but in the most mundane way possible. Tax evasion, property fraud, and embezzlement charges were filed against several founding family members. No dramatic trials or media circuses, just quiet plea deals and restitution payments. The property trust was dissolved, its assets distributed to pay back taxes and penalties. My wife's recovery was slow and incomplete. The indoctrination ran deeper than I'd understood. She attended therapy twice a week, working to untangle the web of fear and false beliefs that had been planted during those Tuesday meetings. Some days she seemed like herself again. Other days, she'd stand at the window watching the empty corner lot with an expression I couldn't read. She never spoke about what happened during those missing days, and I learned not to ask. Reggie struggled with nightmares for months. The sleep deprivation and psychological manipulation had left scars that couldn't be easily healed. He changed schools, needing distance from classmates whose parents had been part of the 12 families. His grades suffered, but slowly, he began to rebuild. He never spoke about his time in the Henderson house, but sometimes I'd catch him drawing dark figures with scratched-out faces that he'd quickly hide when I approached. The neighborhood transformed as new families moved in, unaware of its history. The HOA was dissolved, Barb's position eliminated along with the Byzantine rules that had governed our lives. People began talking to each other again, hosting barbecues and block parties without the underlying current of surveillance and judgment. It felt like a community awakening from a long, troubled sleep. I kept vigil at the empty lot on winter solstices, not because I believed in their delusions, but because someone should remember what happened here. Someone should acknowledge the families driven away, the lives destroyed by fear and manipulation disguised as protection. On those cold December nights, I sometimes heard what the children heard, whispers from underground, but I recognized them for what they were, the echoes of collective trauma, the sound of buried secrets trying to claw their way to the surface. Former neighbors occasionally crossed paths with me at grocery stores or gas stations. Most looked through me as if I were invisible, unable to acknowledge their role in what had happened. A few nodded sadly, sharing a moment of mutual recognition before hurrying away. We were all complicit in some way, all stained by our participation or silence. Petrov sent one final communication 6 months after leaving, a simple note that read, "Thank you for breaking their grief. Mine remains." No return address, no way to respond. I hoped he'd found some measure of peace, but I suspected he'd simply moved on to investigating another family tragedy, another corner house in another neighborhood with its own dark secrets. The empty lot where the corner house stood became a strange memorial to collective delusion. City plans to develop it always fell through. Contractors reported equipment failures, workers refused assignments there, not because of any curse, but because stories have power, and the story of that corner was one of generational trauma disguised as community protection. Even those who didn't know the history seemed to sense that some ground should remain untouched. 2 years later, life had settled into a new rhythm. The neighborhood looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed. New families lived in most of the houses, bringing fresh energy and perspectives. They complained about normal things like barking dogs and property lines, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had once governed these streets. The empty corner lot had been officially designated a pocket park, though no one had actually developed it. Children played there during the day, but even they avoided it after dark. My family found a fragile peace. My wife continued therapy, slowly reclaiming pieces of herself that had been buried under layers of induced fear. Reggie graduated high school and chose a college far from here, needing distance to fully heal. We didn't talk about those months very often, but when we did, it was with the careful tone of survivors comparing scars. Sometimes I'd see former members of the 12 families around town, Barb at her craft store, helping customers with innocent enthusiasm, others working ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives, as if the foundation had never existed. The mass delusion had broken, but its effects rippled outward in ways both visible and hidden. Recovery isn't a destination, but a journey, and we were all at different points along that path. On quiet nights, I'd walk past the empty lot and remember Petrov, the man who'd come seeking answers about a decades-old tragedy and instead became another victim of the cycle. His courage in saving my family that night had started the chain reaction that brought everything crashing down. I hoped wherever he was, he knew that his uncle's death had finally been acknowledged, the twisted system it spawned finally broken. The corner house was gone, but its legacy remained in the whispers of wind through grass, in the careful way neighbors now watched each other, in the unspoken agreement to never let such madness take root again. Some cycles end not with justice, but with exhausted silence, and perhaps that's the most realistic ending of all. The foundation was destroyed, the families scattered, the conspiracy exposed in the most mundane way possible through tax fraud, rather than supernatural revelation. We lived quietly among new neighbors who thought the empty lot had always been a park, while those of us who remembered carried our knowledge like hidden scars. The homeowners association was gone, dissolved along with the power structures that had enabled such collective delusion. On winter solstices, I still kept vigil at the empty lot, not from belief, but from remembrance. Someone should witness the spot where fear had been transformed into control, where grief had been weaponized across generations. The whispers children heard from underground weren't supernatural, but psychological, the echo of buried trauma seeking acknowledgement. The only victory was that no new families would feed the corner house's versus hunger, even if those who'd already paid could never fully reclaim what they'd lost. In the end, breaking the cycle mattered more than achieving justice. The neighborhood had awakened from its long nightmare, and if the price was an empty lot that would never be developed, perhaps that was a small cost for freedom from generational delusion. The truth about that corner house would fade with time, becoming just another local legend whispered by teenagers daring each other to stand on the empty lot at midnight. But for those of us who lived through it, who saw how easily fear could be transformed into control, how grief could be manipulated into compliance, the lessons remained sharp. We'd learned that the most dangerous conspiracies aren't grand governmental schemes, but the small local ones that grow in the fertile soil of shared trauma and unexamined belief.